Hello everyone, it is Tabitha again, and welcome back to Unit 2.5 of the Economics IB syllabus, and today we're going to be looking at a mix of everything we've already understood before, specifically of that of supply and demand. Yes, we're going to be looking at an equilibrium, and specifically today, a market equilibrium. And once again, here's going to be the outline of what we're going to cover today. And as you can see, because we've already done so much logical reasoning and understanding in the past unit, this is going to be quite short. So just make sure you remember everything you've learned so far about supply, and then this lesson will go by so much easier. Now let's start by introducing the market equilibrium and how it connects to this key concept, interdependence. Clearly, when consumers and producers make choices, they cannot make them in isolation. It affects one another. The interdependence of consumers and producers is illustrated when we bring demand and supply together in one model. This model is going to be the market equilibrium. Now, if you guys recall from Unit 1.1, what interdependence is, it's basically how different parts of an economy, such as consumers and producers, make choices that affect each other. Hence, no choices are made in isolation, okay? They're made and they affect other people. Hence, when consumers consume more of a product, producers have to make more of a product to meet that demand. When producers make more of a product, they have to try to motivate consumers to buy more of the product so that the supply can equal the demand. As you can see, there are many ways in which consumers and producers affect each other in the market every single day. And now we are going to bring together both the ideas, like I just said, from supply and demand. We're going to bring supply and demand together to make this new model called the market equilibrium. But once again, we love definitions here, so let's start. What even is an equilibrium? Now, if you have taken science in the past, you might be familiar with the term, but if you have not come across this term in any way, and not even in science, here is going to be the economic definition for you. The concept of an equilibrium is very important in economics, of course. Equilibrium may be defined as, and remember, when you write down the definition, follow these exact quotes. I promise you that you are not going to regret it. The IB absolutely love when you use definitions word for word. But it's going to be defined as a state of rest, self-perpetuating in the absence of any outside disturbance. But let's go ahead and break this down. An equilibrium is going to be a place in which something is at rest and stays in that place of rest unless there is something outside of its control affecting it. So in the textbook, they actually came up with a really interesting example. An equilibrium can be found in basically everything. For example, if you put a piece of paper on a table and there's nothing else affecting it, it's going to stay in a state of rest, okay? It's going to stay sitting on the table. However, if you open up a window right next to it and there's going to be wind blowing, then it won't be at a state of rest anymore because there will be an outside disturbance. But assuming that there is no outside disturbance or there's an absence of it, it will be self-perpetuating, meaning self-rightening, in a state of rest. And economists spent a lot of time considering situations where equilibrii, which is plural for equilibrium, change and the reasons why the changes take place. The main equilibrium we will be focusing on is built from the demand and supply curve. And this isn't just going to apply for the market equilibrium. I swear 90% of the equilibriums we're going to study throughout micro and macroeconomics are going to be built on these ideas from demand and supply. So it's so important to pay attention and understand it now so that you'll be able to apply it way easier later on. All right, so now let's look through a textbook analysis. I found this example of an equilibrium in the textbook, and the analysis is absolutely perfect, okay? And just before we start, I want to point out that in paper 2, it's not uncommon for them to give you a graph, for example, a type of equilibrium that looks like this with 2 or more curves, and then ask you to basically analyze it. That would be like a 4-mark question in paper 2, and there's going to be 2 4-mark questions. So there's a good chance it could be one of this if it's focusing on a microeconomic topic. So here is a picture-perfect example of the analysis they would ask and expect you to make given this graph. So let's go ahead and read it. So let's go ahead and take a look at demand, supply, and the equilibrium for coffee. Both the demand and supply curves for coffee are in the same diagram. And we see that at the price of PE, which is right here, the quantity QE is both demanded and supplied. Hence, at this graph, if you guys look at this graph a little bit more, the point on the graph where supply crosses demand is going to be the equilibrium position, okay? Because it's where the price is equal to the quantity, so supply and demand will be equal. And I'm not going to get too much into it now, but later on, we are going to see examples of where supply is greater than demand, of when demand is greater than supply. But all the time, every time, the entire goal of achieving a market equilibrium is to take whatever happens here and then change it back to supply equaling demand. Okay, that's exactly what we want. And we'll find that using an equilibrium. However, at this point in time, there's an absence of outside disturbances. So this equilibrium is currently self-perpetuating and in a state of rest. Hence, there's a one equilibrium right here. And we would say that the market is in equilibrium at this price since the amount of coffee that people want to buy at that price, quantity represented by the QE, is equal to the amount of coffee that suppliers wish to sell at that price, aka it's just where it crosses over each other. The price PE is sometimes known as the market clearing price, since everything produced in the market will be sold. The market is in equilibrium, since it will stay like this in each time period until there is an outside disturbance. So continuing what I said before, this is a market equilibrium without an outside disturbance, okay? And if there was an outside disturbance, you would get a situation like this or this. But as of now, it's completely equal. Supply is equal to demand, okay? Which is perfect, and that's where we want it to be. Now, a few things I wanted to point out again. A market clearing price. Let's see if I can underline that. Not very well. At this price, PE, it's going to be the market clearing price because, as I already said, everything supplied or produced will be equally demanded, meaning if you supply 5 kilograms of coffee and someone demands 5 kilograms of coffee, well, it's going to be perfect. You'll only supply as much as going to be consumed, and the consumers will only consume as much as it's going to be supplied. Hence, there is going to be no excess and no shortage of supply or demand. And I've already introduced you guys to quite a few graphs, but I haven't yet shown you guys how to draw them. But it is so important because, for example, on paper 2, they might tell you draw a supply equal demand equilibrium curve for kilograms of coffee, and they'll expect you to make a graph from that. So I'm going to go ahead and point out a few different features about a basic market equilibrium graph. Okay, obviously the first curve is going to be supply, and it's going to be S for supply. Do not write supply the full word because it's just too long and it's going to run off the graph. Same for demand. Do not write the whole word demand, only write the letter D. And remember, it's going to be a supply equals demand curve with no outside disturbance like in these two situations if there are only two curves. Okay. After that, you're going to draw the X and the Y axes, and then you're going to label the X axis as quantity of whatever product, and if you're given a unit, the unit. Okay. And then similarly, you're going to label the Y axis as the price of your product and the unit. The unit is almost always dollars, if not euros or pounds, or the currency of wherever you are. And in my paper 2 practice test, I always forget to put units, and you actually can get points taken off from it. It's a really important detail, so make sure not to leave it behind. Now, you are going to go to where the equilibrium is, where S crosses D. You're going to do a straight dotted line down and a straight dotted line to the left until it hits the Y and X axis respectively. Okay? At each, you are going to write, for the Y-axis for price, you're going to write PE. Now, P stands for price and E stands for equilibrium. We know that is the equilibrium or market clearing price. Same goes for Q, okay? Q for quantity and E for equilibrium again. We already know that this is going to mean is going to be the quantity equilibrium. It is where the curve is in equilibrium. And then also you can put a 0 over here to show that this is from 0 to an infinity number on this side and on this side, okay? But don't write the infinity, just write the 0 here. And if you were ever given an example or a context to draw a graph from, that is how you would draw a market equilibrium graph. Okay, and to continue on what we just explored with supply equaling demand, we are going to try to see what happens when supply is greater than demand, okay? Obviously, with the goal and the intention of switching this back to supply equals demand. And we are going to do so using another analysis and using this improved graph of kilograms of coffee, okay? So the same context, but obviously a little bit different because here, supply is greater than demand, and that's a problem. And when supply is greater than than demand, we are going to get a situation of surplus, which is also known as excess supply. However, if you're writing in an essay or paper 2 analysis, I would suggest using both. I write surplus slash excess supply depending on what the examiner prefers. And as you can see, it's going to be this little area right here shown as excess supply. But now we can understand why. As we can see, what will happen if the producers try to raise or lower the equilibrium price. So remember from before, PE for price equilibrium is initially right here with QE, quantity equilibrium. However, this position of when supply equals demand for kilograms of coffee is going to change when producers try to raise or lower the price. And as you guys can see here, the only other price is higher, meaning that they've raised it. So actually, let's just focus on them raising the equilibrium price. In this diagram, the producers have tried to raise the price of PE to P1, P1 being right here. And while realistically there are going to be a plethora of solutions or reasons why suppliers and producers want to increase their price, let's assume for the moment that producers want to increase their price per quantity demanded just to increase their overall revenue and reach their objective of being profit maximizers, okay? However, at this new price P1, the quantity demanded will fall to Q1 and the quantity that producers supply rises to Q2. Okay, now let's take a little look. As you guys can see, there are going to be three quantities down here. You have QE, which we had before, and then you have Q1, okay, quantity 1, and it's going to be Q1 because it's to the left, and we're going to be focusing on where P1 hits both of these curves. So initially, as you guys can see, when PE hits both of the curves, it hits both of them in the same place right here. Hence, you're going to just draw one line down because it hits them at the same place, and it creates QE. However, if you cross both curves with P1, it hits at different places, okay? It hits here for demand and here for supply. Wherever P1 hits, you're going to draw a line down, a dotted line down, and get two values. Q1 for the first place where it hits a curve, and Q2, quantity 2, for the second place where it hits a curve. As you guys can see here, this creates a gap. This gap is the excess supply. As you can see, at price P1, demand is lower here while supply is higher here. And as you can see, this is represented by this little equation here. As when supply is greater than demand, there's going to be excess supply, okay? Meaning if there are 5 pizzas supplied but are only 2 demanded, the excess supply will be 3, okay? And you guys can see how that works with the shift in P1, and it basically relies on where it crosses both of the curves, okay? And as spoken by the analysis, we now have excess supply between quantities Q2 and Q1. So if you write an analysis about this, say there is excess supply or surplus between this value and this value. And for definitions, obviously write this one down too. But an excess supply exists where more of a good is being supplied at a given price than is being demanded. Once again, we already kind of explained that here. Given price, there's being more supplied than demanded. And now while we've analyzed this graph and we see how it represents when supply is greater than demand at improved price P1, remember, we want to meet the objective of being profit maximizers when supply equals demand, meaning that we don't want it to be bigger, we want it to be equal to demand, okay? So in order to eliminate the surplus, because we want to get rid of it, we want to go back to here, producers will need to lower their prices. As they do so, the quantity demanded will increase and the quantity supplied will fall, meaning that although we wanted to shift it up to P1 to make the most amount of money possible, it creates this huge problem of surplus. Hence, to go back to supply equaling demand, we have to reverse this and we actually want to go back down to PE. And then once we go here, as you can see, the quantity demanded for P1 will decrease. Okay, as this line crosses the curve in the middle, the quantity demanded for the higher price will also increase alongside the price decreasing. As you guys can see, P1 crosses it when it's lower and PE crosses it when it's higher. And the opposite will happen with supply, whereas in P1, you have too much supply, so by reversing and going back to PE, we can lower the supply, okay? Supply is decreasing and demand is increasing along the x-axis, okay? And this process will continue until the quantity demanded once again equals the quantity supplied, okay? And this basically just means that it's going to be the process of, if you guys can see this arrow here, let me move it down. Okay, if you guys can see this arrow here, we're going to shrink the surplus or excess supply until we once again get back to equilibrium. Okay, this will be back at the equilibrium price, PE, and so the situation would be self-rightening, basically showing that this is an equilibrium if price is raised for no external reason. This will be back at equilibrium price, and so the situation is self-rightening if price is raised for no external reason, basically just proving again that this is a type of equilibrium. As you guys can read here, if price is raised for no external reason, then naturally it is going to be self-perpetuating in the absence of external disturbances, and the equilibrium will change from here all the way back down to here in a market without somebody or like a government specifically intervening. Okay, and while in this example we basically showed how we went from PE to P1 and then back to PE, you will not be given this type of scenario where you will have to create surplus and then get rid of surplus, okay? But rather you might be given a graph already with surplus, and it might ask you how to get rid of the surplus and go back to supply equaling demand. And what you will have to say, you have to decrease P1 to PE. Now, I hope you understood the logic of surplus and excess supply, because now we're going to be looking at the exact opposite, but still using the same logic. When demand is greater than supply, but we want to get to supply being equal to demand. Okay, this is going to be known as shortage or excess demand. So before we read this really quickly, let's take a look here. Once again, the same context as before, PE and then QE are here. However, instead of increasing the price, we are lowering the price. And as you guys can see, this is going to create this little space here that creates the excess demand or shortage. But now let's read the analysis. Here, the producers have tried to lower the price to P2. However, at this price, the quantity demanded will raise to Q2. The quantity demanded will rise to Q2, and the quantity that producers supply falls to Q1. As you guys can see here, wherever you cross this, once again, you're going to cross both of the curves at the same time. It's QE. However, for the lowered price, it crosses the supply curve here, crosses the demand curve here. Hence, between these spaces, supply is lower than demand, demand is greater than supply, as you guys can see right here. And then because of where it crosses, we're going to create two new lines. Really quickly, on this graph, it's labeled Q3 and Q4 as an extension of the excess supply graph in the previous slide. But I'm going to call Q4 Q2 and Q3 Q1 just to make it easier. But now to define it, okay, an excess demand exists where more of a good is being demanded at a given price than is being supplied. At this given price, this much is being demanded while this much is being supplied. For example, if 5 kilograms of coffee were demanded, but only 2 kilograms were supplied, the excess demand is of 3. And just like excess supply, excess demand is a really big problem because it means that there's a shortage and not enough goods to go around, okay, which we obviously don't want. But in order to eliminate the shortage, producers will need to raise their prices. As they do so, the quantity demanded will fall and the quantity supplied will increase. Okay, this process will continue until the quantity demanded once again equals the quantity supplied. This will be back at the equilibrium price, and so once again, the situation is self-rightening. Basically the same process as before. We're going to go back to this little arrow here and trust it, and we're going to go from P2 to PE. Okay, we want to increase the price to find where the equilibrium is, where these two lines cross each other. And by doing so, we're going to be increasing the supply from here to here, and we're going to be decreasing the demand from here to here to once again go back to that self-perpetuating equilibrium state. Alright, so if you guys understood everything that I explained about the graphs so far, this one should be a piece of cake, okay? But now we're going to be looking at how does the equilibrium shift. Now, really quickly, before I even read through the analyses here, I want to point out that when we looked at units 2.1 and 2.3, we looked at supply and demand curves and how they can shift. For example, if this is supply and this is demand, if they are increased, they're going to go here to D1 and to S1. Okay, they're going to shift to the right. And then they can also shift to the left to either S2 or D2. Sorry, my Graphs are really bad, but just remember from before, each of the curves can shift based on non-price determinants of supply and of demand. But obviously, because these curves can shift, we are going to see how, when they shift, it affects an entire market equilibrium. So as we know, the equilibrium may be moved by any outside disturbance. And in the case of demand and supply, this would be a change in one of the determinants of demand or supply, other than the price of the product itself. Okay, so basically, like I said before, demand can shift and supply can shift based on the non-price determinants of demand and supply, respectively. Okay, each of these determinants are going to be known as an outside disturbances, as they cause the curves to shift and they aren't the literal price. Okay, they're outside inconveniences. Okay, so let's go ahead and take an example of an increase in the income for consumers of foreign holidays, which is a normal good. When income increases, then there will be an increase in the demand for holidays, and the demand curve for holidays will shift to the right, ceteris paribus, as shown in this figure. Now, if you guys remember, one of the determinants or non-price determinants of demand is going to be changes in income. For example, if income increases, you're going to go to the right, and if income decreases, you're going to go to the left. As you can see here, income is going to increase, hence this curve D is going to move to the right to D1. But because it's an equilibrium, supply is going to stay the same, okay? And supply doesn't have any effects taking place, so supply stays in the same place. And as you guys can see, because there are now 3 curves in total, there's going to be 2 places of equilibrium, okay? Here, where the new demand curve crosses supply, and here where the old demand curve crosses supply. And remember, just for reference, the old curve is going to be D, and the new curve is going to be D1. So when the demand curve shifts from D to D1, price initially remains at PE, price equilibrium here, and so we find that QE continues to be supplied. But demand now increases to Q2. So remember, this is just like what we did on the last few slides. So if the original equilibrium is here, then we can mark it as price PE, QE is being demanded. However, because there's also now a new curve for demand, we're going to continue with the line of PE to all the way over here to hit this new demand curve. But now we have a problem that at this specific price, PE, quantity supplied is lower than quantity demanded here, okay? Because remember, at this price, we're going to see where it crosses both the supply curve and the new demand curve, and respectively name them QE for the beginning equilibrium and Q2 for the first place that it moves, okay? So this is actually going to be a situation of where demand is greater than supply, but we still don't want that. But remember, this means that at the original equilibrium price, there is now a situation of excess demand, okay? Remember, excess demand is going to be between where demand is greater than supply, so it's this area here, and we are also going to label this area as excess demand or as a shortage, okay? However, remember, we want to get rid of the demand, okay? We want to get rid of the excess demand. So now, in order to eliminate this excess demand, it is necessary for price to rise until the quantity demanded once again equals the quantity supplied. Thus, price will rise until it reaches this new place of PE1, and the new equilibrium price, where QE1, the new equilibrium quantity, is both demanded and supplied. Okay, so remember, this is basically just shifting the excess demand to fit a new equilibrium. So based on this new curve that we're going to be focusing on, D1, and the original supply curve, we're going to see where they cross, basically where their new equilibrium is. As you can see, I already circled it here before, and this new equilibrium takes place at an increased price, PE1, to stand for equilibrium 1, or the next equilibrium from the original, and then it's going to be at a place where supply and demand have quantities QE1 for the second equilibrium, okay? As you guys can see once again, from this new place, quantity supplied is going to increase from here to here, and quantity demand is going to decrease from here to here. Overall, creating a new equilibrium, but with a higher quantity supplied and demanded, and at an increased price. But now that we've basically analyzed and focused on market equilibriums, let's go ahead and take a break from graph theory for a second, and let's focus on something really basic that we haven't really evaluated yet. Let's talk about price, and specifically, it's going to be defined as a price mechanism, okay? So before, we have seen how the forces of supply and demand, otherwise known as price mechanism when they work together, okay, move markets to equilibrium, okay? So essentially, those processes that we used before to to get rid of excess demand or excess supply and achieve S equals D for equilibrium. Those processes are all defined as a price mechanism, okay? Because we're playing with the prices to put the market back into equilibrium, okay? But now we're going to evaluate the three main incentives for a price in the first place, okay? And those three incentives are going to be signaling, rationing, and incentive functions. Now, obviously, when we're going to be looking at the different price mechanism functions, it's going to be fairly logical and straightforward because we're just going to be evaluating what is the point of price? What does it do for our economies and for our societies, and how does it help us? Number one, it would be to signal information to consumers and producers, also known as a signaling function. The price of a good is an important piece of knowledge for consumers and producers. Prices are set by the actions of consumers and producers in a market, and so they reflect the changing circumstances in markets, acting as a signal to those in the market to act in some way. Basically, this is a summary of just saying that the value of all goods and services in society or in an economy are determined by price. And this makes logical sense. Like, why are some Lambos $500,000? Okay, it's because consumers value it so much that producers can charge that much and consumers will actually buy it. Okay, price basically determines how valuable society in general considers a good to be. This can also be seen with other luxury brands. What is there, like a $50 Gucci t-shirt which is just plain white? Obviously because it's from Gucci and a lot of people in society value Gucci, they will pay more for that product and producers can charge more for that product and be profit maximizers. So essentially we can see how prices are signaling specific information to consumers and producers about how willing consumers are to buy a product and how valuable they consider it to be, which in turn tells producers how much they can charge for the product and still make a profit off of it. The second function is going to be the rationing function, okay, to ration scarce resources. So let's read it. We know that resources are scarce in the world. Remember from 1.1, the world is finite, resources are finite, nothing is indefinite. And they need to be allocated through some mechanism, hence we usually have planned or free market economies. And this is where price comes in, okay? Prices help to allocate and ration scarce resources. If the demand for a good is significantly greater than the supply, meaning that there's excess demand or there's a shortage, prices will be relatively high and the low supply will be rationed to those consumers who are prepared to pay the high price. So this is essentially showing the idea that as the quantity demand increases way beyond the quantity supplied, you'll see how producers essentially ration out who gets their supply by increasing the prices. And as they increase the prices of a certain product, consumers in general will be less willing to pay for it. Hence, they will get to a certain place in rising the prices of their product that they will only sell as much as they are supplying, okay? Basically showing how the richest typically benefit from scarce resources because producers are profit maximizers and want to increase their prices. And lastly, there's the incentive function, okay, to give incentives to consumers and producers. Prices act as an incentive for both consumers and producers. Lower prices give consumers an incentive to buy more of a good because they will receive more utility or satisfaction from the good for their money spent. Higher price will act as a disincentive since the utility in relation to the money spent falls. Now, really quickly, let's talk about this right here. Now, if you guys are at higher level, then you'll remember from unit 2.1, demand, higher level, that we talked about how demand is basically determined by how much consumers are willing to pay for a product. And basically, and let's say you're selling a product for $1 here and $2 here, okay, and we draw lines across to show a movement alongside this demand curve, you will see that as the price increases, less people will buy it because it has to do with the rule of marginal utility and satisfaction. Nobody ever gets as much satisfaction from the second product or the third product as they got from having that first product when we're talking about demanding more than one quantity of a good or service, okay? And this basically relates to this because it shows how if, for example, the government or producers want to control how much people want to demand a specific product, then they will increase the prices because as the price increases, less people are demanding it. But if they want more people to demand a specific product, then they will lower the prices and so more people will demand it in general, okay? And this also works for producers. As for producers, if there is an increase in the price of a good due to an increase in demand for the good, then this gives a sign to producers that consumers wish to buy this good. This is really straightforward, but it just means that if demanders demand more of a product, then obviously suppliers, they want to increase the size of their business and increase all of their production overall. Hence, if they see an incentive that demand is going to increase for their company, then they will supply more to meet that demand. All right, now let's go back to graphs. I know we had a little break without graph theory, but now we're going to return to this market equilibrium. However, this part should be a much easier, okay? Now, if you guys remember from the definition before, surplus, also known as excess supply, is when there is too much of something, then there usually is an equilibrium. And there's going to be two types of surpluses that we're going to be looking at, okay? Consumer and producer surplus, okay? And we're going to look at it according to another market equilibrium graph. However, they gave us a different context. They said quantity of thingies, quite cute. But we're going to be looking at the demand and the supply for the quantity and price of thingies per week. Okay, so now let's read the analysis. This illustrates the concept of consumer surplus, which is defined, once again, another definition, as the extra satisfaction or utility gained by consumers from paying a price that is lower than that in which they are prepared to pay. Now let's figure out how we can find this, okay? As we can see on the graph, the equilibrium price of thingies is $10 and the equilibrium quantity demanded and supplied is 10 thingies per week. Obviously right here, if you have to identify an equilibrium price, PE, it's going to be 10 because 10 is where the S crosses the D curve. And then the quantity equilibrium, QE, is going to be 10 because it's also where the S crosses the D curve, okay? So once we have identified that, we can see how this is determined by the forces of demand and supply. And at this equilibrium point, there are some consumers who would have been prepared to pay a higher price for their thingies than the $10 here. And we can see this by the demand curve. For example, at a price of $15 right here, if we draw a little line and then draw another line down to show a movement alongside the demand curve, we can see that there would still be 5 thingies demanded. And even at a price of about $17, okay, there would still be a demand for, oh, it's a really crooked line. There'd still be a demand for about, let's say, 3 things, okay? And while some consumers are willing to pay $15 or $17 or anywhere above 10 in between $20 for this good, they will just have to pay the equilibrium price at the moment because, well, obviously that is the equilibrium. That's all they have to pay. So even though consumers might be prepared to pay this much more above the equilibrium price, at the moment they are actually gaining because they are saving the money here and just paying this equilibrium price of $10, okay? Now this means that all the consumers in this area here who would have still demanded the product, even if it was above $10, have made a financial gain, okay? They have paid a price below the one which they are prepared to pay. Now if we go back to this definition, we can connect it, okay? Remember, consumer surplus or an excess of consumer satisfaction is the extra satisfaction which they gain from saving money here, gained by consumers from paying a price, aka $10, lower than that in which they were prepared to pay, which would be anywhere between $10 and $20. Now, if you were to draw consumer surplus on the same market equilibrium in a paper 2 or paper 1, for example, I want to show you what it would look like. Typically, people shade in this little triangle area, okay, because it is above the equilibrium price, but still below the demand curve. So if you're ever drawing this on a test, just shade it in and label it as consumer surplus, okay? Now, really quickly, before we move on to producer surplus, I want to point out that in paper 2s, if you're asked to define something, there's going to be about 2 points awarded to each definition, meaning that there's 2 parts to one definition, okay? Now, while we've already defined consumer surplus as the satisfaction by consumers, we also want to point out that the total consumer surplus is shown by the area under the demand curve, okay? This is really important, under the demand curve and above the equilibrium price, okay? Meaning that you can show directly on a graph where the consumer surplus would be. And then, of course, we have the opposite. We have producer surplus. So once again, let's start with the definition, okay? It is defined as the excess of actual earnings that a producer makes from a given quantity of output, over and above the amount the producer would be prepared to accept for that output. Now let's read the analysis and then we'll connect it back to the definition. It should also be clear that at this equilibrium point, remember this is the same graph as before for the quantity and price of thingies, some production of thingies would take place at a lower price than $10. See, while the equilibrium price, again, for producers or suppliers is $10 for 10 thingies, obviously because of the supply curve going below this equilibrium point, this part here still includes the producers being able to produce the same quantity of goods but for a lower price as it goes down this y-axis, okay? So this is all shown by the supply curve, okay? So for example, at a price of $5, there would still be 5 thingies supplied, and at a price of $3, let's say here, there would still be 3 thingies supplied. So we can see that even as you go below the equilibrium price, they can still spend less money to still produce a lower amount of output, meaning that they can save money and not produce as much as 10 thingies for a price of 10. However, producers never have to sell their quantity of goods for how much money the quantity of goods took to produce. For example, they don't have to sell 5 thingies for $5 just because that's where it crosses the supply curve. And instead, they can sell their thingies at the equilibrium price. Okay, they can increase it basically up to here. They can sell a quantity of 5 for $10 because it is the equilibrium price. And that means that here, the producers would have made a gain on the x-axis between 0 and 10 quantities supplied. They would have made a gain on each of these items because they are being paid more, a higher equilibrium price than they were prepared to accept, which would have been where the quantity crosses the S-curve on the y-axis. Okay, meaning, for example, let's go back to the quantity of 5 thingies. While they would have been prepared to accept somebody paying them $5 for 5 thingies, because the equilibrium price is higher than that, they can actually charge $10 for it, meaning that they are gaining in this area right here. This is their gain in extra satisfaction, okay? Meaning they've received higher prices than the ones that they were prepared to accept for buying their goods. And once again, this is proven by the definition, okay? Because it is the excess of actual earnings between this area here that a producer makes from a given quantity of output over and above the amount the producer would have been prepared to accept for that output. And once again, if we're talking about quantity of 5 thingies, the excess satisfaction for producers comes from here, between the higher equilibrium price and that price of $5 in which they were initially prepared to accept for a quantity of 5 goods. And once again, if you were drawing a graph and you want to show a type of surplus, for example, this time, producer surplus, you could actually color in the triangle here and you could label it producer surplus, okay? And once again, we're going to extend this definition by a second part, okay? The total producer surplus is usually shown by the area under the equilibrium price, sorry, it's a messy line, and above the supply curve, okay? Once again, it's under the equilibrium price, but it's above the supply curve. All right, so now taking everything we just gathered from those past 2 or 3 slides, we're going to go ahead and familiarize ourselves with a bunch new terms to prepare ourselves for a topic in this unit a little bit later on. But so far, we want to connect what we've learned to these future terms, okay? So let's talk about allocative efficiency. So when a market is in equilibrium with no external influences and no external effects, it is said to be socially efficient or in a state of allocative efficiency, which means that the resources are allocated in the most effective way from society's point of view. So for example, if we draw a very simple market equilibrium graph, let's say that there's no shift in any of the curves because there's no external disturbance and it's self-perpetuating and it's in a state of rest. Because this curve shows supply being equal to demand, all resources are being allocated efficiently, okay? As there are 5 pizzas supplied and 5 pizzas demanded, okay? There's not too much product and there's not too much demand. It's perfect and it's the goal that we're aiming for, okay? And this is achieved by a free market, which leads to allocative efficiency. But now we're going to introduce another term, community efficiency, in this case, which we'll explore on the next slide, is maximized. So it is the optimum allocation of resources from society's point of view. This occurs where demand is equal to supply, like I said here, or where the marginal social benefit is equal to the marginal social cost, which if you're not familiar with these 2 terms, don't worry, we'll look at it on the next slide. All right, so now let's take a look at the 3 new terms we introduced before. First of all, what is community surplus, or sometimes from the IB syllabus, they call it social surplus. It's the same thing. Make sure to remember that. Well, it is the sum of consumer and producer surplus is known as community or social surplus. This is the total benefit to society, meaning that all the extra satisfaction gained by both consumers and producers that benefits society overall is going to be the community surplus as labeled on this graph. Also, another important note, at this equilibrium of P and Q, where demand is equal to supply, community surplus is maximized. So essentially, because the consumer surplus from this point to this point and the producer surplus from this point to this point are all filled, we can consider this point right here to be where it is maximized, okay? And this is also known as the point of allocative efficiency. And by definition, although we'll look at this in the later topic in this unit, like I said before, where community or social surplus is maximized is known as allocative efficiency, because remember, it's still the point where supply equals demand. Once again, we're not going to explore this until a little bit later on, but you might as well familiarize yourself with these terms that I showed in the last slide, okay? We have marginal social cost and marginal social benefit, also known as marginal utility, and they are shown by the acronyms MSC and MSB, respectively. And when we introduce the topic of market failure, we're going to become so familiar with these terms. But as of now, if you ever see this term, might as well go ahead and memorize it. It means the supply curve, and this down here, and this acronym means the demand curve. And now, if you are in standard level, you are free to go. I hope you were able to understand this, and make sure to rewatch it or take notes if you're struggling with this topic. And I have some good news for higher level students. We don't have to learn more theory with market equilibrium, thank God. We just have to do some very simple calculations. So let's get started. Short outline of what we're going to be doing. All right, so now let's talk about calculations. So for paper 3s, because this is a higher level extended unit topic, higher level students will have to do a lot of calculations for graphs, okay? And as we go on, you're gonna see what I'm talking about, but this is the first graph calculation we're going to approach. And in 3 easy steps, we can find the areas of all the surpluses, okay? So let's take a look. As you guys can see here, it's another market equilibrium. It looks a little bit different, but essentially, you as a high-level student might be asked to calculate the surpluses, consumer surplus, producer surplus, or both, being community surplus. Now, if you're wondering how to do this, if you've actually taken any middle school level of mathematics, I'm sure you know how, but essentially, we're just going to find the area of this triangle for consumer surplus, the area of this triangle for producer surplus, and the area of both triangles for community surplus. But in case you aren't aware of how to do that, I'll walk through it with you, don't worry. Okay, so let's pretend that the question is asking to find the community surplus. Now we can break this down to 3 sections: finding consumer, producer, and then community. Starting with consumer, the first thing we want to do is identify the equilibrium price and quantity. So as you can see, that would be $900 for quantity and $3 specifically, equilibrium price. And if you guys don't know how to find the area of a right-angled triangle, I'm a little scared for you, to be honest, but in case you need it, let's see, how would I draw this? Okay, right-angled triangle formula is gonna be base times height divided by 2. So essentially you're going to pretend that this shape is going to be a full rectangle, and you're going to then divide the shape by 2 to make one triangle, okay? So let's go back and let's try that. So if we write the formula, the base is between 0 and 900. So the base is going to be 900, and then the height, okay, we're going to multiply that by the height, and the height is between 3 and 5, so the height is 2, and then we're going to divide by 2. And then obviously these two cancel each other out, and then our consumer surplus is going to be $900. You're going to make sure that you're going to calculate this in the unit of the price. And the same process is for producer surplus. So let's go ahead and use the same formula as before. And remember, we still have the same equilibrium price and quantity. So we're going to multiply the base 900 by the height, which is between 3 and 1, which again is 2. So times 2 divided by 2. Once again, the answer is going to be $900 using that unit right there. And as we said before, consumer plus producer surpluses are going to be equal to social surpluses. So now we just got to add them together. 900 plus 900 is going to equal $1,800 or $1,800. And that is literally it. That is all the calculations you would have to do if you're asked for this on a paper 3. And that's going to be it for this unit topic of 2.5 market equilibrium.